the Serbian parliament is built on the remains of one of the greatest mosques in the region. People would call it the Hagia Sophia of the Balkans. This is a republic is built on genocide. The way this republic was established was through ethnic cleansing. I can give you the example of my own family's village. What triggers the downfall of the Ottomans was the decentralization of the empire. Elite members of rulers who are ruling semi-independently in the Balkans. So they're called the Ayans.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Today we have Alan. Assalamu alaikum, Alan.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
Barakallahu fiqh for coming. So how are you?
Alhamdulillah, very well. Just came back from living 6 months in Istanbul. I just came back to UK yesterday, actually. So,
Okay,
yeah,
definitely a change of weather. How is the change of weather inviting
yeah,
you? Yeah.
yeah, definitely. It's been a rainy day. I went from like 27-degree weather to pure rain as soon as I came in.
Yeah. And do you like it? How is Istanbul?
It's living in Istanbul. It has its positives and negatives. As a historian myself and a traveler, traveling former Ottoman lands from the Balkans to Turkey, it's
Hmm.
got its positives there. Being immersed in this city with so much history, so much. It's very kind of. I'd say it was quite formative in my kind of personal journey and how I want to, take my career as a journalist, writer, historian, and the type of things I want to look at, but also Istanbul itself, as a modern city, it's huge. To go there for a holiday for a week is different from living there for 6 months. You get to see kind of a different side of the city. It's chaotic, it's busy, it's a
Hmm.
lot, put it that way. But it was, alhamdulillah, it was a very good experience.
Alhamdulillah. See, you said you're a historian. Your Instagram name is Alan the journalist. So you put yourself as a historian, but then you've also put yourself as a journalist. So can you explain
Yeah.
that a little bit?
Right. So I guess I'll just go into a bit of my background. So right now I'm a final year in my MA of Islamic Studies. So I'm pursuing that, and my main research is on the history of Islam in the Balkans
Mm-hmm.
and the history of genocide in the region. So how has this genocide, we saw the genocide in Bosnia and then in Kosovo in the 1990s, but how has this come to be? So the roots of this, how has it happened? It stems back hundreds of years. So this is where my research focuses on, as well as kind of Ottoman history. I'm a historian at heart, so I like to, I read a lot. I visit all these sites. I travel. I write about this. And yeah, like you said, I'm kind of still early on in my career of kind of trying to build up as a journalist and writing about these experiences, writing about history and all these topics. So that's how it kind of crosses over. So my studies, so I've spent the last 4 years studying Islamic studies, but what I focus on, because that's quite a broad spectrum. So what I focus
Mm-hmm.
on within that is history and Ottoman history and within the Balkans. So I kind of take that background and I apply it to kind of the modern political sense of what's going on in the Balkans now, combining with the history of the region and
Mm-hmm.
wider Ottoman sphere, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes, yes. And so how is it connected with journalism?
Right, yeah. So I mean, journalism there's a journalism is a very broad spectrum as well. So journalism can be, you writing about a modern situation that's developing, or it can even be, talking about something within history. It's just about getting a form of media out there to an audience and for it to be in an accessible format. You have video journalism, you have writing, and my background is as a writer. I've been involved in different forms of writing for the last 4 years. But I guess where journalism comes in is where my mission, I guess, is to write about these issues and communicate these issues that the Balkans and wider Muslim history, persecutions, genocides that they have faced, but also to kind of show the greatness of these civilizations and show
Mm-hmm.
how Muslims went from their heights to through colonialism to their persecution. So it's more so just about putting a form of media out there for masses to understand. And whether this goes into various different publications or my own kind of newsletter or my own page, it's just there's a different ways of communicating those ideas.
That is very intriguing. So I want to start with what actually led you to this journey? Let's start with that.
Yeah, very interesting question. So I guess I'll give you more about my background. So born and raised in London, but originally kind of my ethnic background is half. Bosniak, half Sicilian. So if you look at it from the perspective of history of Islam, it's very interesting. You have the Sicilian side of which, we've been very much involved with the Arabic civilization, ruled under Islam. And a lot of our culture and whatnot has heavy overlaps with North African influences. But that being said, I'm not an expert on Islamic Sicily at all. I'm also
Hmm.
focused on the Balkans and whatnot. So I guess when I was 18, I traveled back to Bosnia for the first time by myself. So before that, I'd been a handful of times, but it was from when I was 18, I hadn't been for like 4 or 5 years, right? So I went as a solo traveler by myself, just fresh out of school. And I was going around and I was seeing these different masajid. I was hearing the adhan. I was in Europe, in this Muslim country in Europe, and I was seeing visible Muslims, people who were
Hmm.
visible Muslims, hijab and whatnot. And I wasn't raised in a particularly Islamic environment. I was raised between, secular, modern, whatever, atheist background, let's say, m very much between, Bosnian culture and Italian culture, let's say.
Cultural
Yeah.
Muslims in your neighborhood.
Yeah, yeah. So my dad's side of the family, they're like, we'll just say Muslim by name, because a lot of due to the history of communism in Bosnia, a lot of the Muslims, by the time, the war came in the 90s, they weren't, practicing, they were just Muslim by name. So me, I wasn't really raised with that. But so I went there to Bosnia by myself, Sarajevo, Mostar, and I was seeing and hearing the Adhan, and I realized this is Islam exists here and it's got 5 centuries of heritage here. So I guess this kind of led me to a spiral, a rabbit hole of looking into Islam more and the history of the region, and it kind of sparked kind of like a dual event where it sent me, into a deeper journey of spiritually, developing myself as a Muslim, a young Muslim man, but also with a fascination of the history of the region. So
Hmm.
after this, fast forward now, I'm 22. I've traveled, a lot throughout the whole of the Balkans, through Sanjak, Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia, all these sorts of small little places, Bulgaria, Kosovo, Albania, Macedonia, and of course now having lived in Istanbul for 6 months. So it just triggered me to learn, I kind of accumulated more of these experiences, and now I've just started kind of writing about them, sharing about them, and I'm hoping to kind of grow my platform and whatnot.
Inshallah, inshallah. May Allah bless it with put barakah in whatever works you're doing.
Inshallah.
Alhamdulillah. So let's get straight into the topic, which is the history of Islam in Bosnia.
Mhm.
So where do Muslims how does Bosnia become Muslim?
So
Or
this is a very,
the
very
Balkans?
interesting and uh, loaded topic, let's say, because when we look at the Islamization of Bosnia and the entire Balkans region, it's one that in the last kind of 300 years, if we look at the scholarship within the European canon, especially within the Balkan Christian nations, so whether it be Serbian literature, Greek, Bulgarian literature, it presents this Islamization of these native Europeans as a very, very negative topic. So Muslims are portrayed as people who converted for negative reasons. So let's say, forced conversions. Forced conversions is one of the most common ones, or, social mobility to climb the ranks of societal, and whatnot to get into the elite, or economic reasons, avoiding jizya or less taxes and whatnot. But if we look at the actual conversions, so within Bosnia specifically, Bosnia is what I like to call a frontier society in terms of the religious aspect. It's where essentially East meets West. A lot of people say this starts in Constantinople and Istanbul, but I truly think it starts with the border of the Balkans and where the Orthodox Christian world starts. Eastwards, for me, that's where the East and West starts. So Bosnia, if you look at the geography within Europe, Bosnia is kind of exactly where the Orthodox world starts. So it's where the split between Christianity, Catholicism, and Orthodoxy starts. So within this itself, you have uh, so if we look at Bosnia proper, you have Catholics and you have Orthodox Christians. And
Hmm.
historically, there's been a divide between these populations in this country, but you also had different kind of pagan traditions, different sorts of Christian sects of there was a various different groups of Christianity within Bosnia historically, and especially considering the kind of rural nature of Bosnia. It's very kind of a mountainous country. A lot of these religions weren't actually able to gain a strong foothold in Bosnia. So there was a kind of there's a few theories about the Islamization of Bosnians in terms of there was the Bogomil theory, which they say that there was this church which was kind of independent of Catholicism and Orthodoxy, but there was also the Bosnian church. So I kind of, from looking at the scholarship I'm reading, I'm more of the opinion that it was the Bosnian church. So it was this independent church which was deemed as heretic by both papacy and Eastern Orthodoxy, who were being persecuted, right? So I'll fast forward a bit. So if we look at the 15th century, when the Ottomans came in, the Bosnian church was essentially almost collapsed. So the leaders of the Bosnian church, they had gone into hiding, and the Bosnians themselves, so the ones who abided to this church, found themselves in a persecuted position. You know, you had the west side, the Catholic papacy, who were wanting to do kind of crusades in the region to try convert them, and you also had them being persecuted by the east, by the Orthodox. So when the Ottomans came, they actually offered Islam as a solution, as a protection. For example, if you look at the declaration that Sultan Mehmed al-Fatih gave to the Bosnians when he entered in 1463, it's very much kind of it's got this tone of portraying Islam as another option for their protection, ensuring their protection under, you know, the flag of Islam, under the Sharia, and that's what Islam did for them. So it's not necessarily kind of a forced conversion process or for other reasons. It's more so that these Bosnians who lived in rural environments, who weren't really members of any solid tradition, any solid religious tradition, they kind of found this as a solution or as a kind of sense of belonging more to kind of a world religion, a larger community. You know, you have this powerful Ottomans coming and sweeping through the Balkans and whatnot. You know, they must have heard of them already, and they come here and they offer you to be a part of them. And I truly believe that this is the main way that Islam spread. And then from there, you know, it just slowly goes and goes. And by the 16th century, you already have majority Muslim population in Bosnia.
So I was talking to another historian.
Mhm.
He was telling me that the Balkans had their first Islamic encounter through the persecuted Muslims from Sicily towards the Balkans.
Yeah.
Does that have any foothold?
So there, historically, the Balkans has actually had a lot of, well, not a lot, but let's say more so than, let's say, like Western Europe or Northern Europe, engagement with Islam. So even from the time of Al-Andalus,
Hmm.
a lot of these slaves, so Al-Andalus had a lot of slaves, and most of the time they were Slavic slaves from the Balkans. So we know already that a lot of them were taken from the kind of the Dalmatian Peninsula all the way maybe up into Bosnia. They were kind of recruiting them and taking them on from the coast to Al-Andalus, and inevitably you would have had slaves who were converted to Islam. Some maybe even had returned and kind of propagated this. You also have kind of various different Turkic migrations because, you know, as they entered Anatolia in as early as the Turks entering Anatolia as early as the 11th century, you know, they did make their way through kind of in smaller sporadic movements. So there
Hmm.
was, you know, sort of an earlier kind of let's say Muslims there, but that
Ex
didn't really spread anything, let's say. So I
hmm.
wouldn't I wouldn't say or follow the opinion that there was a prevalent kind of Muslim dawah going on or
Presence.
anything
Hmm. So
like that.
it's
Yeah.
it starts slowly there, and then from the Ottoman
Yeah.
protection, it starts to grow.
That's where it flourishes and
Okay,
it really
okay.
spreads from like a personal level to a majority level. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Hmm. So it's about protection. What happens next?
So what happens next? So I mean, what happens next is what happens with the majority of the Balkans. It becomes, contrary to popular belief, the majority of the Balkans had actually become Muslim. So, for example, if we even look at the statistics, population statistics before the First Balkan War, so let's say 1911, at that point, only 51%, so still majority of the entire Balkan region. So when I say the Balkans, I'm talking about from Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, parts of Hungary, Greece,
Greece,
Romania, you know, all the way into the Thrace region of Turkey. This was a majority
region.
Muslim. Yeah, the population was majority Muslim. So from the 15th century onwards, this Islamization process, you know, continued. But one thing that I want to raise kind of as a topic here is that when we look at the history of Ottoman rule in the Balkans, it's very much tarnished by um, the last 2 centuries of Ottoman rule. So the last 2 centuries of Ottoman rule, we see a struggle from, well, I say struggle, but this is how it's framed in the kind of Balkan nationalist movements of the 19th century, a struggle for liberation, of de-Ottomanization. So what we see here is kind of this portrayal of the Ottomans as this evil force of kind of suppressing Christian rights. And I'm not denying that there wasn't some level of oppression. Of course, there was. We're not going to sit here and portray a biased version of history, but
But this is in
it's
the last 2 centuries.
yeah. So in the last 2 centuries of Ottoman rule, so I'd say from as early as the 1700s to the 1900s, we have this portrayal of Ottomans in the region as oppressive, backwards, and whatnot. But what this actually does, it overshadows what happened before that. We have 300 years of historic kind of tolerance, historic, integrated societies of Christians and Muslims. And another thing which I think is important to talk about this when we're looking at this topic is, you know, the majority of European history on the Ottomans focuses on the divide between Muslims and Christians. It's always about, Muslims versus Christians. It's the Muslims as the oppressors or the ones at the top of the society and the Christians at the bottom. But this is not in any way, shape, or form the policies that the Ottoman sultans themselves pursued from their earliest kind of existence from, let's say, the 14th century onwards. The Ottomans always viewed the Christians and the diversity within the empire, religious diversity was actually their strength. So, for example, if we look at Sultan Mehmed al-Fatih, he was ruling a majority Christian empire, right? Constantinople, when it was conquered, for the first few decades, it was only 60% Muslim, right? 40% of Constantinople was actually Christian. And we even have districts. So if we look at the Galata district, which if anyone here has traveled to Istanbul, you know Galata Tower, Taksim, this is the Galata district. That was actually only 35% Muslim in the 1470s. So you have areas which are still majority Christian, right? So for a large part of the early Sultan's history, so you have Mehmed Fatih, you have Bayezid, you have Selim, they were more concerned of how they can integrate Christian communities to be part of the empire, not how they can divide them and oppress them, because they were majority ruling these regions with Christians. So what we see happening is when the Ottomans enter a newly conquered territory, they offer an option to the elite, the rulers of the region. They say, you can convert to Islam and you can stay as the rulers of your territory, right? So this is, some people deem this as controversial, but in my opinion, this is just how religion works. If we look at the history of Christianity, people converting from other religions into Christianity and whatnot. So these elites of these countries or these territories that were conquered, they were converted to Islam willingly, often not forcefully, although, the kind of, what's it called, the choice was either, you convert and rule as Muslims or you give it to us. But this is where we see the vassals. So it was more so a question of how they can integrate Christians and how they can willingly bring them into the fold of Islam. It was not sort of a question of oppression or kind of blood and plunder and whatnot. So this is what I think is important to bring attention to, and to remember that if we look at Mehmed al-Fatih, for example, a lot of the kind of the way he speaks about himself, the titles he gives himself, he's also almost more leaning towards seeing himself as a Western ruler, like, a Caesar, an emperor, rather than, of course, he's a proud professor of the faith of Islam and he was a Ghazi, a warrior of Islam, but he doesn't shun the Western side of things away. He doesn't kind of, just come in as this Islamic brute who's putting everything down. No, he's integrating. So the early Ottoman sultans, they're more focused on integrating these different religions, because if they didn't do that, the Ottomans who are known for their religious pluralism would not have lasted as long as they have. So we have this rewinding, this kind of overshadowing this negative lens of the last 2 centuries, which overshadows all this other kind of time of religious pluralism and openness, which I think is forgotten about in large part and not talked about enough, especially within Europe. European
Mhm.
history. So what triggers the downfall of the Ottomans, or let's say their perception as a weak kind of declining power, which they were a declining power in that time, was the decentralization of the empire. At this point, the empire is huge. You know, it stems all the way from Bosnia all the way through the Arab lands, you know, very far reaching. So naturally, it's difficult to centralize and govern such a vast and especially diverse empire. So what we see in the Balkans specifically is we see the rise of notables, so kind of elite members of rulers who are ruling kind of semi-independently in the Balkans. So they're called the ayans, the provincial notables. And then they start from as early as the 17th century, but more so taking form in the 18th century. They are really abusing this power of the
Mhm.
decentralization and the struggle of Ottomans to kind of exert their
And
presence
who are
over the.
these ions? Are they
Yeah.
ethnic? Is it an ethnic group? Is it a religious
Good
group or?
question. Yeah,
Hmm.
so the Ayans is just it's just a title. So it's like a pasha or it's just a title of a kind of a provincial governor. And the Ayans in the Balkans especially, most of the time they are of ethnic background of the areas which they are ruling. So for example, if we have Albania, the most prominent ones are Albanian Ayans. So they are ruling kind of semi-independent almost already in this point in the 17th, 18th century regions of Albania, Greece, or Bosnia. So what they are doing is they are largely exploiting the populations there financially due to the Ottoman land system. So they are overtaxing because they were responsible for collecting taxes to send to the capital, right? So what we see happening is kind of almost an exploitation tactics where they are collecting more taxes than they should, and then in turn this creates this sort of whole kind of image of Ottomans as kind of, you know, backwards and whatnot. But in reality, this wasn't the Ottomans themselves. It was their struggle to gain a centralized foothold in these regions. So these regions, you know, you have a lot of them, a lot of these ayans, which I can give a famous example is Mehmed Ali, one of the rulers of Egypt. He is one of these kind of prominent pashas who, in the 18th century, or yes, something like that, he ends up going to Egypt and ruling Egypt for himself for, you know, like a long time. I'm not an expert in this region, so I can't comment on it too
Hmm.
much, but he's just an example of one of these provincial notables who takes more power than they should have and kind of causes issues for the Ottomans. So this is where we see the downfall of kind of the Ottoman greatness in the Balkans specifically, and it's where we see more of these negative perceptions of, you know, Christian populations being more, let's say, subordinated. And I'd say this has overshadowed previous centuries of tolerance and
So
coexistence.
that creates a tension between the Muslims and the Christians in the
Yeah.
Balkans.
Right. It more so creates. I mean, it was not just Christians who were unhappy with this rule. It was Muslims as well because they are, you know, they're not happy with their rulers. There was many uprisings. You know, some of the most famous uprisings were, of course, there in Serbia, the Serbian uprisings starting in 1801, where they are essentially are rebelling to kick the Ottomans out. For example, in Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, is was it was majority Muslim city. This is, you know, I've posted about this and I got a lot of slack for this, saying that Belgrade was a Muslim city, but I'm just speaking demographically that the majority of the population that was living in Belgrade for, you know, 300 years and whatnot was Muslim, right?
Hmm.
Whether they came in, they were converted. The majority of them were actually Slavic Muslims, so native Serbs who were converted to Islam, which uh, I guess would be considered Bosniaks or whatnot. It was majority Muslim, and in 1862, in Belgrade, there was an event which is called the mass expulsion of the Muslims from Belgrade. So they kicked
Hmm.
out like thousands of Muslims were killed, and it was a very kind of brutal event. And in Belgrade alone, there was I can't remember exactly how many mosques, but there was a lot of mosques. I don't know if it was I can't say exactly, but there was a lot of mosques. Today, only one mosque remains in Belgrade, one. And another example, which is quite ironic from this, is the Serbian parliament. So the parliament building in Serbia today is built on the remains of one of the greatest mosques in the region of Belgrade. So it was even described by Evliya Çelebi, the famous Ottoman traveler, 17th century Ottoman traveler. He was when he was going through the Balkans, he described this mosque that is now the Serbian parliament as this kind of, this marvelous mosque. I'm pretty sure it was called the Batal Jamia. So Jamia means mosque, Batal Mosque. Um, and it was a people would call it kind of a second to the Hagia Sophia or the Hagia Sophia of the Balkans.
Hmm.
So this is kind of the heritage of Islam in the Balkans and the how the modern nation states are kind of built on top, quite literally in this example, on top of the ruins of a mosque is the national Serbian parliament, which I think is quite interesting if you think about it.
Indeed. So, which century was it? Like they rebelled against the Ottomans and kicked out Muslims? Which century?
Yeah. So
Which
that's
year?
the 19th century. So start of 1800s. So you have some Serbian uprisings starting in 1801, 1802. And this is where we see kind of the large scale nationalism starting in the Balkans. And the nationalism in the Balkans is where a lot of the problems start for the Muslims, right? This
Hmm.
is this is a period where Muslims go through various forms, various cycles of genocide, starting from this period. I'll just talk about the nationalism briefly. So in this period, we see the countries of Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, Greece, pushing for their own independence movements, right? They want to be free from the Ottomans. They want to have their own nation states, just as it is all over the world. There is the movements of nationalism, the rise of nationalism, French Revolution, all these sorts of things that are sparking these kind of independent nation states movements. But the problem with the independent national movements within the Balkans is a very ethnically diverse region. You have pockets of Muslims, Christians, and it's mixed. It's a tapestry of cultures and whatnot. You can have one Muslim village next to a Christian village. You have Jews in a city. Sarajevo, for example, was called the Jerusalem of the West. I know you've had Haris on the podcast
Yes.
who's mentioned this. The
Yes.
Jerusalem, Jews, Christians, Muslims, everyone. Um, and this is everywhere in the Balkans. So how do you create a nation state from the ground up, an ethnically homogenous nation state, may I add, in such a diverse region? The only
Hmm.
way to do that, according to their logic, is, of course, expelling or killing these Muslims. So there's one book which I'd like to mention, which I recommend anyone who can get their hands on it. It's by a American historian called Justin McCarthy. The book is called The Death and Exile of Ottoman Muslims from 1821 to 1922. So right now we're speaking about this period particularly. So 1821 is where these nationalist movements arise, and 1922 is the end of the Second Balkan War, so 1922, 1923.
So,
So
okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, I was just going to say the a general figure of this book so you can understand how the persecution started. So between this period, 5 million Ottoman Muslims were killed. This doesn't include just the Balkans, this includes the Crimea, the Caucasus, and whatnot. And another 5.5 million were driven from their lands. And I can give many more examples of statistics from the Balkans specifically, but this is just to help you understand how when nationalism came to the Balkans, what this caused for the Muslim, historical great Muslim communities in the Balkans.
And when you described it, can you just let me know, is it only Christians rebelling because of nationalism? Is it only Christians or also Muslims who, because if you take the example of right now Albania or
Yeah,
did Bosnians also rebel against the Ottomans? Did
yeah,
Albanians, did Kosovans?
that's a good question. So when I talk about the nationalist movements, it's more so the nationalist movements of the Orthodox Christian countries.
Hmm.
So it's Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro. They were the strongest independence national movements. Of course, you had certain smaller national movements. For example, there was, of course, Albanian national independence movements. But when we look at Bosnia and Bosniaks, I'm not entirely sure. I know there was a lot of rebellions within Bosniaks. There was certain rebellions. For example, there's one famous kind of elite member. He's called Hussein Garashevich. He led a very important rebellion against the Ottomans, and he was a
Hmm.
Bosnian Muslim. So, of course, there are pockets of Muslim uprising against the Ottomans because at this point in history, a lot of people are unhappy with the Ottomans, including Muslims. But when I talk about the nationalism, which was so kind of catastrophic in the region, I'm talking about the Orthodox Christian nations who sought to create ethnically homogenous countries, free of Ottomans, of Turks, of anyone. So this is where the issue arises: is this kind of this bid to create ethnically homogenous nations.
And you said Ottomans, but is it you categorize Ottomans, but
Mhm.
does that also mean like Muslims? Did they categorize the
Yeah,
expulsion of Muslims as well?
very good question. Very good question. So in this time period, the nationalist narratives and the nationalist history kind of intellectual, they use the term intellectual lightly because it's a lot of kind of fictionalized narratives that they produce. A lot of them, in fact, I'll just say, a lot of them refer to the Muslims of the regions. So whether it be Bosniaks or Albanians, Pomaks, which are
Hmm.
Bulgarian Muslims, Turks, so actual Turkish tribes, Tatars, they'd simply refer to them as Turks. So they are
Hmm.
reducing the ethnic differences and the beauties of the different tribes and cultures simply down to the word Turk or Ottomans, but usually they just refer to them as Turks. So it didn't matter if you were if you were a Bosniak, if you were an Albanian, if you were a Greek Muslim, a Cretan Muslim, anyone, you were simply deemed as a Turk. And in this period of history, it's it was the period of history where these movements wanted to de-Turkify and de-Ottomanize the regions because they wanted to rid everything of Ottoman influence of Muslims. And of course, the Muslims who remained, who were of the native population of these regions, were deemed as the heirs of the Ottomans. So they represented everything which the Ottomans did and which is what they didn't want. So you can see why the kind of ethnic cleansing happened against all these different populations, from Bosniaks to Albanians to Greeks to Bulgarian Muslims to Tatars. That's why. So that's a good question and a good point to raise there.
How have these historical incidents that you told me about, these genocides and persecution, how have they transformed into modern day, to the modern times?
Right. Yeah. Great question again. So I'd say that the main way, the most kind of clear way is, of course, in 1992, we saw the Bosnian War starting, which was a very difficult kind of period for the Bosnian Muslims. It was internationally recognized as a genocide. It was a very kind of brutal period of ethnic cleansing all the way up until 1995, even bleeding over into 1996 and 97. And of course, we have the famous example of Srebrenica, which, I'm wearing the Srebrenica rose here. The anniversary is coming up in just about a month time,
Hmm.
30th anniversary, actually. So yeah, these issues have actually come to affect the present and are still affecting the present. For example, the issue of mythologized history. This started in the 1700s with what is called the Eastern Question, which is the question intellectuals posed as what do we do with these Muslims in our countries? What do we do? How do we reconcile with them? How do we get them out? Or how do we build our nation? This is the Eastern Question. So these issues have come to affect that the way history is understood today. So the reason why I talk about this and why it's so important to share these messages is because the way you understand history directly shapes what is actually done in practice. So, for example, I'll give you an example. The 1389 Battle of Kosovo. It's a very, very famous battle in Ottoman history, in Serbian history, in everything. And it's essentially where the Ottomans they won the battle and they opened up expansion for the Ottomans to come into the region and eventually conquer the surrounding regions. But this battle in particular, it serves as one of the backbones to the Serbian national identity. So who they are, why they are so kind of proud and fervent in their opposition to the Ottomans. And it's kind of become a mythologized narrative which presents their leader at the time, who's Prince Lazar, who was killed in the battle, along with Sultan Murad. So, quite ironically, both the Ottoman forces and the Serbian forces, both their kind of leaders had died. Sultan Murad was killed in the Battle of Kosovo in modern day Kosovo, as was Prince Lazar. And it kind of turns these figures into kind of these mythical figures of pride and nationalism and kind of which portrays today Kosovo as the cradle of Serbian orthodoxy. So, of course, this is problematic because how has this bled into the present, right? We have
Hmm.
the battle. We have Kosovo, and what happened in the 1990s. I mean, in the early 2000s as well, in Kosovo, with the Kosovo Albanians and the Serbs, and still to this day is high sources of tension. So it's these historical narratives which create mythologized views of who we are and how we've created our country. When I say we, I'm talking about the perspective of the others, of course.
Hmm.
That affects the modern day because even in Bosnia in the 90s, the ethnic cleansing of the Bosnian Muslims was seen as a kind of a revenge for what the Ottomans did in the region, for all the Christian boys that they took and they converted, and all the oppression
Can
and
you
whatnot.
address that a little bit? Is it a myth that or is it true that the Christian boys were taken and converted? And there's more going on. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's definitely not a myth. It's very it's well known in the scholarship. It did happen. So what would happen from 14th century onwards is the Ottomans would go into the Balkans and they have something called the levy. So it's essentially a tax which takes young Christian boys from the Balkans and it converts them essentially to be slave soldiers of the Sultan. So they're raised in the imperial palaces and imperial quarters, whether it was in Edirne in the earlier period, then Constantinople, Istanbul, and they are taken, they are converted to Islam, they are, raised as Muslims to be fighting soldiers of the Sultan. What people don't understand is, of course, I'm not denying that this was at times, of course, devastating for the families. Imagine, your son is taken by the Ottomans and whatnot. Of course, this caused devastation at times, but it's not as barbaric as is portrayed. So only one of the oldest male child was allowed to be taken, so only one. So it wasn't, the whole, all the children gone and kidnapped and whatnot. Secondly, it actually provided a lot of opportunity for these Christian boys to climb to the elite, the very, very heights of the Ottoman Empire in power. And for example, I'll give you the example of Mehmed Pasha Sokolovic, right? He was from modern day Bosnia. He was taken as a boy.
Can you repeat again?
And
Can you repeat again?
Mehmed Pasha Sokolovic. In
Hmm.
Turkish, he's known as Sokulu Mehmed Pasha. So he was taken in the 15th century as a Christian, Bosnian Christian boy. He was converted to Islam, and he rose to be one of the most prominent Grand Viziers in the entirety of Ottoman history. He served under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. He was serving at the golden age of the empire, and he climbed to these levels. And he was originally a Devshirme recruit. And what people don't realize is that when these members were taken, right, they would still remember where they're from. They would remember their languages. They would still give tribute to their families and their native lands. They would not just, turn it to the oppressive Turk per se. They were actually recognized, and they were even given names to remember where they were from. So, for example, you have Hersekzade Ahmed Pasha. So from Herzegovina, they retained their names, or they retained their roots, and they were known for giving back to their native lands. For example, Mehmed Pasha Sokolovic, he built a lot of kind of uh like
What was the
waqf in
reason? What was the reason to have such type of policy where you take young boys? Because it is, as you said, it's
controversial.
devastating, controversial as well. So why did they even do this?
So the reason why was I mean it's a question which is a lot of scholarship is needed on more, I'd say, and one that I don't think I'm fully informed to comment on why they did this, but it was a very successful policy for the Ottomans themselves because these recruits who would go on to make the Janissary armed forces were actually the driving force of the Sultan's conquering. So they were elite military trained forces. So the reason why was to kind of excel their conquering, to strengthen their army. It was mainly a military kind of vehicle for the
But
Ottomans. And
that's my question. I don't understand.
yeah,
Why can't you have like already Muslims
right, the
sending
question was
their
good.
children? So why take particularly the Christians? Because here you're converting, and
Mm,
there's some bitterness
yeah,
in the family.
yeah. So the idea is when you take someone from their roots and their family, and this is controversial me speaking about this, but I think it's important to present it how it is because we're not portraying the Ottomans as these kind of perfect practitioners of Islam who did everything by the book because they didn't. We know that from the start. So it is correct and somewhat needed to be critical of the Devshirme janissary policies. So the idea here of why they didn't take of Muslims in the early period is because when you're taking a boy from his native village, you're essentially taking him away from his family. You're taking him away from his roots, his language, and kind of making them have allegiance and loyalty and kind of this sense of familial ties and kinship to the Ottoman kind of identity in the Ottoman Sultan because they were essentially, at the end of the day, they were the slave soldiers of the Sultan called Kapikulu. Kul is slave in Turkish. So it was this idea of kind of making them loyal to the point where they didn't have anything. But in practice, this wasn't the case because, as I've given the example, various of these grand viziers maintained very strong connections with their families. And with the example of Mehmed Pasha Sokolovic, his family, part of his family ended up willingly converting to Islam and also rising to being a great kind of ruling family elite within the Balkans. So it's not as black and white as you see. And at the end of the day, a lot of families would offer their sons and willingly offer them to be able to have opportunities. It was the chance to gain an opportunity. So rightly so, we should be critical about it, but we shouldn't be overly critically about it as the nationalized historical narratives are, which they present as some sort of kind of backwards,
Barbaric
evil,
practice. Yeah,
barbaric.
there is nothing good out of it. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, it's somewhat of a gray area, but like I said, we should look at the historical facts and not, be biased in
Mhm.
either side.
So coming back to the Balkan, what do you call them? You talked about Kosovo. You said
Yeah.
Serbia wants. Is that why Serbia right now does not recognize Kosovo as an independent nation?
Precisely. Yeah, precisely. And so the Battle of Kosovo and historically Kosovo is has an importance in the Serbian Orthodox Church, right? A lot of the oldest monasteries of the Serbian Orthodox Church are within Kosovo. I've been to Kosovo myself. I've traveled around. I've seen some of these monasteries, these old kind of monasteries from the 1300s. It's amazing to see, they're still standing actually. Not destroyed as many would believe. Of course, they're not in use because there's not many Serbs left in those specific areas. But it's a reason why they don't recognize it because they still see it as territorially theirs. This being said, this is a topic which I do plan on writing about a lot more, which is the issue of Kosovo and mythologization. Not sure if I'm saying that right, of Kosovo within the Serbian history. So, like I said, this 1389 Battle of Kosovo has led the people to have this strong connection with the region, even though historically Albanians have had a presence there as well. And it's not as black and white as the national mythologized historical narratives, which claim that this is the cradle of, Serbian Orthodoxy and that's all it is. Because, again, it's more nuanced than that.
Mhm. And how does Russia play into that region? Because I know that there is a bitterness with Soviet Union and stuff. So a little bit about the Soviet Union. How did their presence come into the Balkans?
So the Russian presence, we can trace actually the Russian presence in the Balkans as early as the 1700s, late 18th century. And the Russians have actually had a very important, not very important, but they've had an established role within the Balkans of creating and fueling the nationalist movements because Russia themselves, Orthodox Christians, the Balkans, majority, not majority, but the Christians in the Balkans are majority Orthodox Christians. So they were in the 18th century and 19th century, the Russians themselves were actually propagating this kind of greater Slavic state. So they were actually aiding the Balkan nationalist uprisings by sending their own forces. They were called, I can't remember the exact name of the special type of forces, but they were actively involved. And in the present day, I wouldn't say it's much so today something that should be focused on
So
or is a big
as
issue.
they were propagating the greater Slavic nation, they were also pushing communist ideas.
Yeah, so communism comes a bit later. So
Mhm.
as we know, communism was very prevalent in the Balkans. You have Yugoslavia, you have Albania under communism, you have Bulgaria, and this is a period which I think should be, a topic for a whole other podcast, is communism in the Balkans and what this happened. So
Mhm.
when this happened, again, it's not directly from Russia per se. For example, Yugoslavia was distinct from Russia. In fact, Josip Marshal Tito, as we call him, Tito was the leader of Yugoslavia, the main one. He was actually not allied directly with the Soviet Union. He kind of created his own socialism kind of league of countries which are actually independent from the Soviets. So it was not so much that the Russians were involved in this. In the case of Bulgaria, they were. But again, this is a very rich topic, which, maybe might make for a future conversation, inshallah.
Definitely. So, yeah, what about you spoke about the what do you call Serbian presence in Kosovo? What about Albania and Bosnia? What are the tensions that are modern day tensions going on in that region?
Yeah.
Montenegro.
So of course, the modern day tensions, they're the main areas of tension in the Balkans today are within Kosovo and within Bosnia. So in Bosnia, half of the territory of Bosnia is under the Republika Srpska, which is the Serbian Republic. So under the Dayton Agreement, after which ended the war in 1995, half of the territory was to be the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and half of the territory was to be the Serbian Republic. So within this Serbian Republic, what we must understand is that this is a republic, which is this is an undeniable fact, is built on genocide. The way this republic was established was through ethnic cleansing. I can give you the example of my own family's village, right? We come from a village in Eastern Herzegovina, which is today under Republika Srpska. That village was ethnically cleansed in 1993. Over 100 people with the same name as me in that village where my family comes from were killed. And that village is no more. It's rubble. It was burnt down. They were killed, and it's now part of the Serbian Republic. So the tension today lies between the separatism movements, nationalist separatist movements of Republika Srpska, and of course the fact that this republic within Bosnia is causing serious issues on the international stage, and the fact that it was built on cultural genocide and ethnic cleansing and destroyed mosques and all likes of that. But again, this is a very complex topic, but that's where the conflicts lie in modern day Bosnia politically. Within Kosovo, it's largely the same. Again, I'm no expert on Kosovo, so I can't comment too much on this, but again, the issue of the Serbian myth of Kosovo as being kind of this sacred mythologized land, which has fueled more nationalism. So again, these are some of the issues, and a lot of them are very controversial and difficult. But yeah, that's what I say.
I've never understood the name Bosnia and Herzegovina. Like, why do you have two different names? Because here is it, you have the Serbs and the Bosnians. Where does
Yeah.
Herzegovina comes in?
Yeah, so Herzegovina is just a region. So it's the southern region of Bosnia. So it's kind of there's a stereotype within Bosnia. I mean, it's true. It's different kind of geographically. It's just the southern region of Bosnia is called Herzegovina, and this was given as a name it's something to do with some sort of a Germanic. I don't know why it's called Herzegovina, but it's a region of Bosnia, just how there's other regions of Bosnia, and it's historically it's much more hotter. It's got much more Mediterranean climate. The culture is slightly different. The people, it's just a cultural region, just as you have like the north of England, which is north, and you have the south of England, or you have Northern Ireland. It's just a region, and that's essentially it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Inshallah. So, do you have anything else important that you want to add? I think we need to keep this another separate topic. We have to do another one to go dive in deep. So,
Of
is there
course.
any particular topic that you would like to address?
Um, the only thing I think I'd depart with saying is the importance of knowing history as Muslims
That
in
was my
order to.
next question, actually. I wanted to ask you that question. Yes, please go
So
ahead.
why is history important for Muslims today? So we are seeing an increased climate, unfortunately, of hatred and Islamophobia and genocide. What's happening in Gaza is crazy. This is genocide. And genocide never starts in the present. Genocide starts with history and understanding history, but also genocide starts from the warping and rewriting of history according to certain narratives. So as Muslims, we need to be aware of this. We need to learn, and we need to teach our own history in an accessible manner. I talk about this, but I also talk about lighter topics of coexistence, of how we've lived together for so many centuries, and the greatness of Islamic civilization, not just this. So it's important as Muslims we know history not from a rewritten perspective, so we can kind of understand these issues which are happening in the present. And that's I think something important that I urge everyone to look into listening to this.
I wanted to address not just learning. What about what do you call it? Narrating your story? You just mentioned. So, how important are these fields like being a historian, being a journalist for Muslims? Because our community tends to I don't know about the European Muslim community, but at least the Asian side, the Middle East and the South Asian
Yeah,
side tends to focus more on doctor or becoming an engineer. So how important are these fields right now for Muslims
yeah.
to claim their narrative?
Very important. I mean, you see the media narratives are clear to see that Muslims are always portrayed in an not always, but largely portrayed in a negative light. Why do we have such why do Westerns have such negative perceptions of Islam? It's because of the media. So I really, really do think it's important for Muslims to start their own channels of media or share media and contribute to different media and publications, whether it's content on your own Instagram or writing for different publications which are, helping the Muslim cause. You need to Muslims need to go into these careers more, be proud of it, and by doing this, we'll create more opportunities for each other as a whole. We can start different publications and jobs arise, and it will give way more options to us rather than going the traditional route, which a lot of, as you said, Asian and Arab Muslims go within engineering or doctor or medicine and whatnot. So it's a very
And the other question I want you to comment on this. The inspiration that Muslims, because if you get into scholarship, these topics, especially the genocide, these are controversial topics, and you might be censored. So this can hinder people to pursue, into these fields. What lessons can these, not these, actually us, what lessons can we learn from the Bosnian Muslims who endured the genocide and still kept their Islam? How can we learn from them as to tackle the environment that we're living in right now, the Islamophobic climate that we live?
Yeah, so a very important question. Of course, we have to recognize that the situation in Bosnia is not, idyllic. It's not like, they're living in perfect harmony. Bosnia today, we can't portray it as a perfect society. Largely people have moved on, they've forgotten, but the scars are still there. But what I will say is that for those who did endure what they endured, they always maintained their deen and their belief in Allah. Their belief in Allah. That's the most important thing through anything. Whatever career you're in, whatever tribulations you go through, whether it's you're in a war, you're being targeted, genocide, whether you're whatever it is, you always need to maintain that pillar of your life, which is your iman, your faith in Allah, and maintain this throughout everything. Because this, Allah provides for everyone. Your belief in Him, whether if you don't get given in this life, you'll be given more in the afterlife. So just stay steadfast. And there's countless stories I can go into from the strength of the Bosnians' faith of what they endured and how they are kind of reviving Islam today and staying with that.
I mean, could you give one example? I think it would be inspirational for all of us.
Yeah. Right.
Do you have any one example on top of your head?
Top of my head. I mean, today, right, if we look at simply, okay, I'll give you a simple example. All the mosques which were destroyed in Bosnia, I believe it was something like, I'm not sure, but I think it was something like 2,000 mosques were destroyed, right? That's insane. The heritage that was lost there is lot. And since the war, we've had a lot of help from the Turkish government in rebuilding these sacred sites and whatnot. Historical mosques which are 500 years old, and everywhere you go now, you will see a mosque in Bosnia, and even in the Serbian region. So, for example, in Banja Luka, there was one of the main mosques there, which is the capital of the Serb region, was destroyed, and it was only rebuilt in the early 2000s. And these rebuilding of mosques and the importance the Muslims there place on their cultural heritage, visual cultural heritage of these great mosques, which I think is amazing because this is, these mosques are important. They are visual representations. They are places of worship. And we shouldn't just let them be buried, and these active rebuilding of these mosques, 2,000 mosques destroyed is tremendous, is crazy, right? Is
Mhm,
2,000,
mhm.
right? So
And then yet they
rebuilding the
built it. They kept their
yeah,
Islam and they rebuilt it. So how
yeah.
important is for people to visit Bosnia? Like, what's your word uh, for
Yeah, I
us?
think it's tourism now in the last few years, last 2, 3 years, I'd say has opened up a lot. You're seeing more content on Instagram, more travelers going and kind of, telling these stories. I think it's a beautiful country first and foremost. Beautiful nature. People are very warming, they've been through a lot. They know how to welcome people and whatnot. The nature, food, it's important to visit, but it's also important when you visit to maybe just educate yourself a little bit on the history and go to see these sites with the lens of history. So, it's amazing to go through a 500-year-old kind of quarters of an old town and think, okay, this from here, this is a Jewish synagogue from when Sarajevo was, religiously more diverse, or even to the modern day, visiting, different the graves of the martyrs and whatnot. So it's important when you're traveling to this region to know the history and educate yourself, but also, of course, to enjoy the beautiful nature that is on offer and have a good time.
It's definitely a beautiful country. Inshallah, I have to visit it as well. Inshallah, in the future. So, any last points that you want to conclude on?
I think that's everything. Maybe I can just tell people where to find some of my work or something.
Yes, I'll put that in the link. I'll
Yeah,
put
sure.
your works in the link. So I guess we'll wrap it up here then.
Yeah, yeah, we can wrap it up here. And yeah, I write articles on my Substack. That's kind of my main form of content is written, but I do create content
Mhm.
on Instagram, which I've just started. So people can find me
Great
there. And
page. Definitely, I would recommend people to follow your page. It's really
still,
amazing.
still a young page, but we'll get there, inshallah.
Inshallah, inshallah. So, barakallahu fiqh, Alan. Thank you for coming and enlightening us with so much history and beauty. And
Yeah,
inshallah, we'll stay in touch. Again, we'll
yeah.
have another meeting.
Great
Barakallahu fiqh.
conversation. Eid
Thank
Mubarak
you.
to you.
Eid Mubarak as well. Assalamu alaikum.